I'm Dan Hobbs. I'm a specialty crop grower. We've been growing annual crops for many years here in Pueblo County, Colorado, near the village of Avondale. We farm on 40 irrigated acres. We specialized over the years in garlic and lots of diversified seed crops, up to 70 varieties of seed, which we've grown for national seed companies. And several years ago, we started to think about the need to get into more perennial production on our farm, and we started to get an interest in fruit trees, largely because we've had a couple of sour cherries and a couple of mulberry trees on this property, and we saw that they bared fruit pretty much every year. And so we got in touch with our old friend and colleague Gordon Tooley and began to interview him about the prospects for growing fruit in the Arkansas Valley. And soon enough, we were planting fruit trees together. So we've got Gordon down here today. And I was just going to ask him a couple of questions about an appropriate fruit selection for the Arkansas Valley. We know we've got lots of different climates and elevations in Colorado, all of them challenging for a variety of reasons. But I just wanted to hear directly from the expert what would be a good choice of fruit for the Arkansas Valley, and why the sour cherry in particular is suited to this region.
Okay, well that's a good question. In looking at the region, the site, the aspect, the slope, the soil types, we're close to the river here, so that's an area where all the cold air from the Rocky Mountains is coming down the Arkansas. On the western slope, peaches and nectarines and cherries, the early bloomers, apricots, still struggle, but flower really, really early. The tart cherry is extremely cold hardy, good to 40 below zero, stays rather compact and easy to manage, is late flowering, and is still fertile. We chose 4 varieties here so that we have staggered pick dates, so that we have a longer harvest season, but we can also keep up with the planting. Historically, this exact location was planted in tart cherries, and I think that when people were immigrating and migrating to here, they were able to read the landscape and see where there were frost pockets and places to avoid, and what would stand a chance. I certainly think if our first people coming across the Santa Fe Trail or up the Camino Real or wherever, if they were to plant apricots and peaches, they would have not had any return on their investment in sometimes decades. And so when you get a good harvest once every 10 to 15 years, economically that's not going to help support a farm or put food on the table. So these stone fruits flower on second year wood, so the recurrence of heavy bearing annually is really high. Certain fruit trees are shy annual bearers, or going to a biennial bearing cycle, which you can trick them out of that with pruning at different times. But this was a reliable plant, and as long as attention to the location in the field and the soil types and the correct planting, it's not a long-lived plant, but can be very precocious, early producing, and come into bearing and be part of the farm infrastructure. Not only are we looking at staggered pick dates here, but we're also looking for habitat for beneficial insects, pollinators, perennial covers, that we have a succession of bloom all summer long. So when the plant is done flowering, our native bees or our domestic bees and the predator insects have a place to forage and live. Otherwise, if we just focus on them for pollination only and have a bare floor here, we have a weak link in our holistic management structure here. So this also provides a living corridor for the activity that's going out in the fields that need to be clear. So our insect control strategies are greatly improved by having perennial corridors here. And so if you're going to have woody plants intermixed in your site, might as well have something of commercial value. Tart cherries are extremely hard to find in this part of the country. Usually bakers and chefs that are worth their salt are having to buy flash frozen stuff from Michigan or from the north. It's a cold hardy plant, so it's not found in the warmer parts of the U.S. You know, sweet cherries dominate in the Central Valley and the warmer parts of the country, but the premium for baking, for juicing, and for drying are the tart cherries. And so this is a product that you have to be on your game. Once it's time to pick, they are vulnerable to start breaking down quickly. So the strategy is to get them off the tree with the stem on, get them cooled off, and get them into the hands of somebody who's going to put them on their menu in a day or two. With the stems on in cold storage, they can last, a couple of weeks. But if they're picked and are missing the stems, they'll brown in a couple of hours. So highly perishable. I don't think that the farmer should get involved in pitting and processing unless they're going to do juices and drying, because you can't pit them and have them that quality shiny red color that we associate with this plant. Many uses. Anthocyanins are really getting attention. Tart cherries are really high in that, so people are really looking at what else can they take to help maintain their own holistic health. And holistic farming means whole health, so it's not just the health of the plant, but the health of the soil and us and all of the microbes and flora and fauna that is here.
Excellent. So if we could focus just for a quick minute on the choice of this particular tree. If you're a grower wanting to get into fruit production, what kind of ramp up, what kind of timeline is needed to plan, develop the site when the tree comes into production? I mean, what sort of investment are we talking about in time in order to get a product to the market?
Okay, well, I guess from the first thing that you would do is get on your site, and how does air move in the orchard? How does water move on your site? Because cold air is going to move in exactly the same place. So we don't want to site our orchard in the coldest, lowest part. This farm is kind of on a break of a hill, so the convection is breaking right here at the ditch, but the cold air is moving on down here, and it wants to end up in the river bottom down here. So the lower part of this field over here is probably a cold area. We're right here on the edge of a hill. The cold air's moving down this way. More than likely, most of our cold air is coming from the west to the east, because that's the direction of the river. So our convection is moving down through these rows to the road. It takes a turn at the road and goes to the river. So this is a good spot that doesn't collect pockets of cold air, frost pockets, which, you could get a frost here in June, some morning, a heavy dew, clear night, a lot of evaporation, a lot of condensation, and super cooling. So this area moves cold air well. That's the first thing, is to figure out what are the invisible physical things going on your farm. And the way that you can map those is early in the morning or in the evening, you walk out into your field and you can feel thermals. You walk into a wall of warm air, or if you have some shorts on, in the evening you can feel cool streams of air in the evening, and you can kick a spot in the dirt, and you can actually map that corridor of cold air. So we don't have to look at our layout in a linear pattern, and we'll get to our layout in a second, but it could be on contour, following the contour of the natural flow of the land. But being aware of how does air move on your orchard site is the most important part.
Probably followed by water, huh?
That's right, because you can't move your orchard, and you also have to think about, what are my other crops that I'm going to grow in here? Like if we were going to do a diversified orchard with different types of fruit, tart cherries, pears, plums, apples, they all have a different height and a genetic expression. So we need to understand, how does the sun come across from the east to the west? And if we put our tall trees to the south and our shorter trees to the north, the shade is going to come across and deny them sunlight. So we need to look at the aspect of how is the sun moving across the land, and what are the heights that we want so that their shadows come around in the morning to the evening and don't cover the next plant. Or also, if you have areas that you want, that you're going to intercrop and you want morning sun on them, you don't want to plant them over to the west, because that's going to cool, it's going to stay cold longer. So we have to think about, angles of the sun, heights and aspects of the trees are all part of that. And then our spacing. These trees are on 10-foot centers. The 4 types are all going to stay relatively like 6 to 8 foot tall and wide. So we have room here to go 4.5 feet out here. This tree has 4.5 feet out here, and we have a space in here between where they're not going to rub on each other. The width is 17 feet, which matches the small combine and the cultivator that has access here, so we can intercrop. We've got asparagus intercropped in here, which is a permanent crop also, and then it's in perennial cover here, but also no-till drill seeding or hand seeding, or putting transplants in the field here could also happen with intercropping, and that reinforces the habitat for insects. We have a perennial root zone here, so we have a really active soil with beneficial microbes. We've got fungi here. We have this incredible landscape below ground and a community. So intercropping in this orchard is going to be a very successful process here. Whereas if we go into a hard bare soil area, we're lacking some organic matter and some protection from the sun and the wind. And we do have this root community here, which is a big capillary wick of holding moisture. So during heat and drought and wind, our soil is cooler and moister here than it would be 50 feet over where there's no living cover. These 4 varieties, I think it's important to, in the seed catalogs and the plant catalogs come out, it's like you want to get one of everything. But the bottom line is, how can I pick some varieties that we have staggered pick dates, semi-dwarfing and dwarfing characteristics that aren't genetically modified dwarfs, that these are naturally occurring sizes. We want trees that don't require staking or trellising, because that's a whole nother expense and infrastructure. These trees are on a vigorous rootstock. They're well anchored. They don't need trellising and support for their lives, so we don't have to deal with that. We want to focus on the low branching, and we covered that a little bit earlier about low branching trees develop a good taper and a buttress and support themselves well in windy sites.
You said it's a short-lived tree. I mean, what's the productive lifespan here?
20, 30 years, depending on soil types. All stone fruits really resent having wet feet. Maybe Prunus americana wild plum grows along ditches and thickets, and it can handle it. But if we have some clay here, so these trees are planted high on the ridges between the furrows here, so we have good drainage. We've opened these up so we have air circulation around the crown of the tree, around the bud union, and where the first lateral roots enter the ground. This is the area we want to have stay dry, and this is the life insurance program for your stone fruits, is keeping the trunks dry and keep them from sitting, if you're flood irrigating, sitting in a basin of water. And poorly drained soils can retain water like for a day or two, and they're sitting in water, and that causes decay and rot, and the crown rot will be the demise of the tree. So You know, when we go to old farms and homesteads or old following wagon trail ruts looking for trees, very rarely do we find cherries. Some old apricots will live a long time. Sweet cherries are usually the first to go. Peaches aren't long lived also. Tart cherries, oftentimes we'll find them, maybe not the cultivar, but suckers like the ones that you transplanted from the Pecos area or La Madera, wherever. But that's the bird cherry like Prunus marginata that grows in the river corridors. It's another tart cherry, a little bigger seeded, thinner meated, a little more astringent, where these are up to an inch cultivar. They pick, when it's picking time, they come right off where the stem is attached to the tree. Higher sugar contents, so they're not, you don't have to add sugar or honey so much when you're processing or canning. You like choke cherries require more sugar and honey, or even adding baking soda to cut the pH so that you don't have to sweeten as much. But the Prunus marginata that you've transplanted and naturalizes all around is short-lived also, and it will produce a small tree or a thicket that maybe the main frame may live like 10 years, but all of a sudden all the fruit's up here, and then once it starts to die, then you start to get suckering. So we've got this rejuvenation, like choke cherries also colonize. So certain varieties always look like they're really heavily producing, but they really have renewing wood that's always coming on. Whereas this one is a cultivar that's budded onto a hardy rootstock. So this is the one that is going to set the fruit. And when we start to get some suckers coming up from rootstocks, those are budding and grafting opportunities that we can continue propagating this cultivar.
So I love what you say about start by understanding your land and the way the air moves and the water and the light. It's really working with the elements. What kind of timeline could a producer expect from reading the land to when they're doing their first harvest?
Okay, let's say that you've got a piece of land and you understand the landform and how water and air moves, and then the other is like knowing that there's a vacancy in a market is important. So in the fall, before your first planting, you come in and you set out your spacing here, and maybe where you know a tree is going to go, this is where you would fork it or dig it or whatever your mode of fluffing up the soil is, and do a cover crop here, you know, at that site, you know, 4 or 5 foot square of like the cover that I brought, and we'll shoot a picture of that list. So in the autumn, all of the beneficial grains, the plants that we want to have root exudates, start building this soil and start to add to the tilth of the soil. So we're priming the site for a replant, instead of all of a sudden coming in, it's been leveled, it's been drilled, holes are mechanically done, whatever, and then plant the tree. Then we have to like repair the soil. We have to get the tree established. We have to start building up the soil profile. So all of these are all factors that the first fall or the first year before planting can be building the infrastructure. Deer pressure, we got gopher pressure. We time to start trapping and changing the behavior of these animals so that when we plant in here, we can protect our investment. So when our fall comes, certain grains will winter kill. That detritus will go back to the soil. Others will overwinter depending on which grains you use. We've got perennial legumes in here. If there's going to be animals in here, we want to pick our legumes that don't cause bloat. So sainfoin is a really important perennial legume here. Has a long succession of bloom for bees and won't cause bloat in animals. So that's a premium plant. And you can harvest the seed from it and continue to spread it. It's a very rugged, long-lived legume. So while the soil is building, then we've contracted for either having somebody graft or bud the material, or it comes in from a somebody that we would hire 2 years ago to do our, we contract out, and it's always 2 years out because they need to do the budding, grow them out, and they send them to us as 2-year light branched is what we brought here. So they are a half to 3/4 inch tree. We're looking at $10 to $15 a unit. And then on planting day, when they all arrive here, they get heeled in. The roots cannot be exposed to air or wind at all. When they get out of the boxes, they go into an already made site for healing in, and then we work out of the heel in pile like we had over here. Many hundreds of trees healed in fine shape. Take what we're going to plant, and we start to plant. So we're looking at one fall of mapping out the site, doing our layout, cover cropping with, and it can be like inexpensive, winter wheats or triticale, barley, things that are going to come up in the fall and over winter, because we want them to start to head out. Then we can cut them, drop them, or let them go to seed to continue that cover crop strategy. And buckwheat, and they're all affordable grains. Then the planting season comes. More than likely, first year is going to be a rerouting time. When a tree is planted in the spring, we're asking it to establish in the newly planted site. It's got to extend out new supporting roots and new feeding roots, and we're asking it to break bud. We're asking it to flower. It might have some fruit, and we're asking it to grow. So spring planting is a busy time for a plant, and we have to be on our game. Can't let them dry out. If it's an extremely windy site and the tree's got some surface area, it might need a stake its first season to keep it from racking and breaking tiny fibrous roots. So all of these things are like, it starts adding up. It's like, it's just not a matter of digging a hole, planting a tree, watering it in, and coming back on payday. This is something that somebody's got to be here every day on the farm turning the crank. It's no different than any of the other production that you guys do, whether it's biennials. I mean, you're doubling your risks, because you're not just cutting broccoli. You are trying to get broccoli to overwinter to give you seed the next year, and you have to be there. So this is definitely a commitment, but this also reinforces that stewardship that we want, and a sense of place. Scale of permanence here is huge. These are all important things that are all part of the landscape of a farm. Woody plants are the backbone of everything. We know what has happened when we remove woody plants from an environment. We start losing soil. We have to have woody plants. So
I learned that this farm was apple orchards until the 1920s.
Yeah.
So it's nice to, 100 years later, to be bringing some woody plants
absolutely,
back
isn't
into
it great?
landscape.
How all of these old practices are now new good ideas.
Yeah.
It's all coming around.
I hope you'll maybe come back this July to eat a bowl of cherries with us, huh?
Yeah. I'll actually bring some large bowls and pick, and we'll cook and eat until we're sick. That's basically what we do when it's cherry picking time. There's a certain time of the day when we drop everything, and when the picking's good, we're looking at 20 pounds an hour of what one person can pick. And it's always the women are better pickers than the guys, because we stand around and chat and eat. But I really think that for a person who is looking to farm, whether it's for seed or for annual crops or for woodies, the scale of permanence is huge, and the stick with it mentality has to be there. These are living organisms, and we have co-evolved together.
Yeah.
So,
one more question on elevation. Because we have so many different microclimates and regions in Colorado, do you think there's a limit to elevation, or does it really more have to do with airflow and such?
I think that there are limiting factors of altitude. Our farm's at 8,000 feet, and it's close. We do sell plant material to people who live at 9,000 feet, and it definitely narrows the menu of what your choices are. So if you live in an area that has, 60 to 100 growing days, you really have to understand that you can't bring in a zone 5 plant or something that requires, they might have early to mid flowering and late ripening. So on the apple scale, there is a whole group of late ripening varieties that we don't do because we start getting cold way before they're near being harvested. So the things that are like down valley, or in the western slope, or down in the Rio Grande area, they grow varieties of apples that we don't, because they ripen in October, late October, November. Arkansas Black is extremely late ripening fruit. Everybody wants that one, and we don't grow it because we don't have the days. So knowing what is the physiology of this plant, these are designed to flower late, ripen early. So there's earlies, mids, and lates. There's late flowering, late ripening, which doesn't work well sometimes. So many of the summer apples, like the old yellow transparent or Lodi apple, flower late, ripen early. And those were cultivars that were brought over from Russia. So we need to understand, like, where do some of these come from? These are from Hungary, a lot of these plants. So we need to know where did they perform and why did they get brought here. And if it's growing really nicely in the Central Valley, it probably isn't going to do as well here. So we need to understand dormancy periods, cold chill requirements. If you have something that has a high chill requirement, it's going to do better here. Low chill, 300 hours or something, probably shouldn't be an option here, even though it's a good cultivar. There are microclimates all over the place. Like, look at Canyon City. It's like the banana belt of Colorado. There are anomalies that can shoehorn into a site, but until you get good at what you're doing, you should probably focus on a handful of varieties that are tried and true, and then start experimenting with microclimates at your place. If you're going to go into jujubes or nut production, find out what are the requirements that those plants need, because sometimes we have cold nights that aren't good for ripening. Places like we have a hard time with chili and tomatoes because our nights are cold. So we need to understand what's going on climatically. It's getting harder and harder to map that because it's so chaotic right now. Our water cycles, our late frosts, our early frosts. They're still like, we kind of know what the phase of the moon is and if there's moisture and what our temperatures might be, but we don't know what our rain patterns are going to be. So we have to understand about the watering, the needs of the plant, the flowering dates, the depth of planting. These are all things that become obvious to you also, because paying attention to details is crucial in the farmscape or in the tree. Like we were talking yesterday, we just touch them and let go, and we feel that live streak in the wood. Or if it's a dead, dry twig, it's warm to the hand and also doesn't pass the snap test. So this is something that we connect with visually and just by touching, and we can tell. It's not a supernatural thing, but it's an awareness that we have with all living things.
Beautiful. Thanks, Gordon.
Thank you.
Okay.
most important part of this tree is in the landscape below ground. Okay, we had to make sure that when these trees were planted, that they weren't planted too deep, because we have some heavy clay soils here, and cherry trees, all stone fruits, really resent being planted too deeply, because once they're planted past the trunk flare or the taper of the tree, the physiology goes from root to bark. And when soil and moisture touches the bark, then we start to get a decay site. And we get crown gall, borers, um, lack of vigor, circling roots. All of these things happen at planting. So if you plant the tree incorrectly, the problems which ensue immediately are almost irretrievable later on. So planting is really important, and that I think we do have that captured here. But this says, well, we have 4 kinds of tart cherries here. Because if you had an orchard that was all one type of cherry, that means everything's going to get ripe all at the same time. And when you have almost 400 trees to pick at maybe 20 pounds an hour, very likely you're not going to get all of your fruit in. We also have bird issues, a lot of deer pressure here. We've got pocket gophers. So I think that a big part of like assessing this orchard after I've been gone for a couple of years is let's look at the map of what's been going on here with the pressures, aside from like shy delivery of water at the very end, some trees that have died. We've got some rootstock coming up, so maybe that'll be a chance, instead of like junk in the tree, it's an opportunity for regrafting or rebudding, because we've got a root organism in the ground here that's thriving. Instead of junking it and looking for a tree to replant, we can take wood off of one of these cultivars and graft it right back on. So the roots are established usually when you top work, either budding or whip and tongue grafting or splice grafting. The roots are established, you get a really good successful renewal. So we do have some loss, and you can see how the loss kind of followed as the vegetation changes from being a thicker perennial cover to really sparse annual weeds. So we can kind of map what our water flow has been, and I don't know what kind of season we're going to have this year, but if we have some serious loss down there, maybe it's time to think about, okay, let's not go into a replant thing. If we got 100 trees down there that are dead, maybe let's abandon that part and focus on keeping good vigor up here. And then it's like, okay, if our surface water delivery system is going to be shy, I don't know what the rotation was every 2 weeks or 2.5 weeks. Maybe the water showed up, but you never quite got it all the way to the end. What's plan B to give these plants water when they need it? And that can be micro sprays or drip irrigation. Pretty basic setups. You can put them in row here so that if you are doing intercropping or cultivation, you're not going to be tearing your lines out. But surface water is probably the most unreliable source of water in the West that there is. When we have it, we have too much of it, and when we don't have enough, we can't have our intended job. I mean, you just can't predict that in 2 hours when you get the water, all of a sudden it quits running. So we need several sources of water for permanent landscaping. Having a living cover here, the perennials, we have a capillary wick that is keeping the soil protected, keeping it from drying out. We've got legumes in here that have the association with the rhizobium bacteria, so we're feeding the microbes in the soil. We want to feed the microbes so that we can feed the fungi, and then that's the immune system for the plant. It's efficiency of how it moves nutrients, how it conserves water. Its growth program is all in the landscape below ground. So that's really something that we want to focus on, is no bare ground in the permanent landscape. And this is, permanent agriculture. So that means it should take the rest of your life, basically, or as long as you've got. So the first thing that I want to look at is on this tree is that I see that there's good wood on here, and today's a good day just to grab the tree and let go of it, and you'll feel a streak of cold in your hand that's colder than the ambient air because these are living vascular tissue and they're evaporating and they're running cooler than the air. So when we're walking along, we'll look at some black and wrinkly wood, and you grab it and let go of it, and it puts a warm streak in your hand. So a lot of times when you're looking at trees, you're not even looking at them; you're touching them, and you can feel it. But you don't want to hang on to it because then your hand starts to warm up the wood and you can't tell. But it's just a touch. It's pliant and it's cool. We've got good clusters of buds up here. Those are all flower buds. These are going to flower this year. So we don't want to prune off this because this is this year's harvest. Summer pruning is a good time to work with cherries. It's a little drier. We don't initiate a replacement to the tree to put more wood on, but a summer pruning retards growth and develops. You can see where we tipped it off here, and it developed fruit buds here. So usually about the next 5 buds down from a pruning mark is where we start to get fruit spurs. And you can see that this was not cut, but it was bit and torn. So that's an indicator that the deer have been coming in here because they never cut clean. They bite and they tear here. So that's who's been doing your pruning in here. But it also, that when the deer are coming through, they're just taking off the tips of soft growth, which stimulated fruit spurs to get built here. So in the absence of somebody coming in out and do summer pruning to stimulate the trees to go into fruit production mode, the deer came through and nipped them. But in other places that we see down here, the young bucks also rub the trees down to death, and what they don't rub, they'll eat. So maybe part of the strategy is like some New Zealand fencing, which is inexpensive electric fencing to make the deer go around, change their migration behavior. You can't exclude them totally, but if you can move them out of the orchard and keep them moving on down to where they go, you can probably reduce some of the pressure from the hoofed creatures. This is a good tree that we've got some rat wire on here. When there's snow or there's leaves on the ground here, you know how when the snow recedes in the fields, we start to see trails of where the mice were. And this is fruit wood. So having trunk protectors like this are good to keep the mice from girdling the trees. But kind of what I really want to do is, and you can see, we've got a bindweed issue here that's going to be probably forever. Kind of the order of business for this would be like, do I come down to a flush cut to where this inclusion is? I see a bud site here that's kind of dormant.
So that's all from a deer?
That's little bucks right there.
Showing off.
They're marking their spot. They probably peed all over here too.
Okay.
They're like
Kind of new. Like we didn't used to have so many.
they're just like trying to get their girlfriends. And you can come back and cut these up. I don't know what's going to happen here. You might have a dead stop here, and you can take this off right here. There's an injury right there too, but it's still good. So
long term, a deer fence around here might work.
That's what I said to him. I was like, we need to put up a deer fence.
yeah. And instead of like putting up a 10-foot tall fence that costs time. You guys good with electric fence?
Yeah.
Well, you can do 2 rows of electric fence around your field that have 2 wires here, one that they can't go under, and another one that is like 2 feet up. So then you got like a foot, 3 foot, and you put them around the perimeter about 3 feet apart. Because then the deer, they look at this geometry
Oh, yeah.
and they know that they have to jump in here and then try to get over the other one.
Okay.
So there's a certain amount of distance that your stakes are right. Also, if you take monofilament fishing line and tie it all around the fence posts over there or around the edges of your trees, they can't see it and they walk into it and it freaks them out. And we're just trying to change their behavior
Okay.
of how they move.
Yeah.
They with an electric fence, and you take some aluminum foil, and you put some peanut butter on it, and you bend it over there to bait them in and shock them.
Do that with pigs.
Pigs.
Hang soda cans on the
Yeah.
electric fence and let them go explore.
Yep, and
They only do it once, so they learn a little.
yeah, and then sometimes it doesn't even have to ever be on, and they won't go near it. You know, a lot of horses won't go near a wire laying on the ground, but they're just creatures of habit, and if we can kind of change that. Looks like cultivar here. So here she pruned it. She took this top out there that was growing up through here, cut it to an outside bud to send it out on a lateral here. Because we don't want it growing up into the center here where the wind's going to blow it and it's going to chafe and rub. We terminated it here, selected an outside bud which had been growing out this way. If there was no bud here or a lateral, then we would just cut, to an outside bud, so it goes out this way. That's outside bud. Inside buds go this way, and usually when I'm looking to build a scaffold on a young tree, I always prune to an outside bud, so it will continue out in this trajectory. Because inside buds would go in this way. But you can take a tree and shake it. I don't hear too much rubbing in there. There's a nice one. What have we got? Wasabi. This is a wasabi cherry from, not wasabi, but wasabi is a valley in Minnesota. It's actually known for its iron ore, but wasabi is a variety that was seen growing there and selected to be a cultivar. These, based on this branching habit, see how they kind of mirror this?
Yeah.
I would say that this is wasabi. So we've already got some regeneration going on here. This tree's still in okay shape. There's a little blind wood from here to here, but this is a nice looking tree. But these inside ones,
Yeah.
see how they're small and spindly? They're on the north side. They don't get much sun. There's not much of a chance of this making fruit. This is our fruit producing side over here. So I'm going to take these little skinnies out right there. See where these two are rubbing?
Yeah.
I'm going to take that to an outside bud right there and take that to that outside bud there, and we're going to retard the growth there, and we're going to put some cherries on here instead of taking them off all the way down. Here we have this one coming internally. We'll just take that off as the flush cut. Looks pretty good. These were tipped right here. So these buds down here are going to start developing fruit spurs. Stone fruits flower on 2-year-old wood. So the wood that grew last year is going to flower this year, which is nice because some apples could take 3, 7, 10 years to flower, depending on cultivar and rootstock. So that's nice. We kind of like doubled our surface area here.
Yeah.
So if we have 2 good ones, that means we lost 2 trees out there that we've still have our,
Yeah.
we're not in a deficit yet.
Yeah, yeah.
That's the way I like to justify it.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah. So that's good here. There's a little dead stub right there. Nothing really major to worry about. But you can see how it turns black.
I was gonna say the color,
Yeah,
just
and it's wrinkly, and we'll get into some here. This is, feel that. That's
feel them.
dry and does that feel drier than this one? And I'll touch that one and let go of it.
Yeah.
Does that feel warm? And it doesn't pass the snap test. Here it was girdled off or broken. We've got an okay branch here. Just gonna take that off clean, right there. Looks like a branch hinged off, got broken, rubbed. It's like a storybook, kind of. This story, she ended up getting cut into little pieces to feed the soil. She's, you know, half of the life of a plant is going bad,
Oh yeah.
like us. So, but here it was cleaned up. She pulled off the some rootstock here. You see some color change there. That's nice to see that. Make the dog nervous. You just pull some this way. Isn't that gorgeous? That's just beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, that used to not be here.
it looks very organic.
There's some little stubs here. I really don't like little stobs on plants because they die and they turn into little dried out stubs that decay can follow down into the plant. So when you're pruning, don't leave stubs. Do a nice flush cut. Every plant has a place on it that says cut along dotted line. It's the collar, and that's where it'll compartmentalize and close off really nice. If you cut down flush and you cut really tight down into here, you'll get an oblique split that will happen in here, and it causes problems. So when you cut, find the collar. See right there, there's a little ring right there, and it'll close off. Nice. Like you can look at trees that have been pruned and they'll close off. If they've been pruned wrong and they've got a big dead stub sticking out of there, it'll always be there and it will rot, and that's where the tree will get a hollow spot in there, and then the raccoons will move in and the birds and all that stuff. So that's a good looking tree there. Here we have a little rubbing right in here, but I'm not going to take this off all the way up here because I would like to have some cherries right here, and I'd like to put some cherries right here and right there. So instead of taking all these off for flush cuts, let's make them fruit sites.
Okay.
See where this is always in the shade here, how thin that is? Doesn't stand much of a chance here of making fruit, but right there are some nice fat blossoms. So we can put some fruit on that instead of taking it off. That's a good looking tree there. Well anchored. I don't see too much gopher activity in there. Who is this? Meteor. Good. Our assessment, you come in through here, you establish your trunk flare, you take a look up here, clear out the bindweed, and we've got good supple wood here. I don't think that these trees need aggressive pruning. Okay, and especially right now is when we want them to flower and give us fruit this year. Summer pruning, and we'll talk about that later.
Okay.
Of timing and where to cut. You know, summer pruning isn't structural pruning. It's small diameter wood to stimulate bud development. We're not trying to do structural pruning.
And that's after you harvest the
Yeah,
fruit.
yeah, it'd be in July.
Yeah.
We usually start pruning, summer pruning. So this would be a nice cleanup right here. establish our trunk flare, check our anchorage. Um, looks like these have been getting bit off nice. Look at the laterals that the deer have actually let these trees do.
Yeah.
One benefit of having those hood wraps.
This presentation is made possible by Colorado Department of Agriculture and a USDA Specialty Crop Block Grant and the Montezuma Orchard Restoration Project. The Montezuma Orchard Restoration Project works to preserve Colorado's fruit-growing heritage and restore an orchard culture and economy to the Southwest region. It's a history that's mostly forgotten now, but some of the first American farmers to come into the Colorado Territory were growers of orchard fruit. Peaches and plums, cherries, and especially apples were grown along the Front Range from the Southeast District down around Fremont County along the Arkansas River and up into the Northeast District, which was the District of the Platte. It was from Denver South, what's now Denver South suburbs, up into the Fort Collins area and north to the Wyoming border. Most of the fruits that were initially grown on the Front Range were actually apples. Apples proved to be one of the hardier fruits to grow there, and there was a good market for it. Though many people thought anyone wanting to plant an orchard at the altitude of Colorado must be crazy, when an apple in Denver could sell for $1.25 each in 1859, or about $40 in 2021 dollars, the incentive was there. Pre-1870, all fruit, all goods had to come in wagon load via wagon train from Missouri and Iowa. It wasn't until 1870 that the train was established. Though apples were the dominant crop along the Front Range, growers quickly realized that peaches did not grow well there, but that plums and especially pie cherries or tart cherries did. With the relatively smaller size of the more tart cherry varieties, the Prunus cerasus, they were able to withstand wind, cold temperatures, and drought better than the larger sized Prunus avium that tend to grow better in warm pockets. These better locations for sweet cherries didn't really open up until the Utes were forced out of the western slope and the area around Paonia was opened up for white settlement. At that point, they started planting cherries there, and sweet cherries specifically, became really prolific there. Though cherries were a crop that was grown on the Front Range, apples were the dominant crop. Here's a picture of the Madison orchard up in Wheat Ridge that was about 300 acres, planted in the late 1800s. When this orchard was planted, the future looked endlessly bright for orchards in Colorado. It looked like a never-ending expansion of market economy and abilities there. Unfortunately, during the late 1800s, at about the time this orchard was being planted, codling moth, the little worm that lays eggs in the larvae that it lays eggs in the apples that become the worms in the apples, became endemic around the Front Range. When this happened, the price of apples fell because the crop was not of a high quality, and the land became worth more for development. We have it well documented from growers that they felt like they were raising crops of apples just to feed and propagate another crop of codling moth. So the land that was closest to Denver, the land that was most desirable for development, like this in the Madison orchard at Westminster, got turned over to development. Most of this land was sold off. Some of the trees were left in place along a backyard or an alley row. Many more of them were just taken out completely. Further from Denver, though, where the land was still valuable for agriculture, growers realized, from having some experience with it already, that pie cherries could be grown well in the area around Berthoud, around Loveland, around Fort Collins, and then down in Fremont County also. So as the codling moth became endemic and started to wipe out the apple orchards, many of the growers along the Front Range switched to planting more pie cherries. During the 1860s and 1870s, growers along the Front Range in the Northeast District and the Southeast District, fruit districts, had a chance to experiment with many different types of fruit. James McClelland of Fossil Creek near Fort Collins estimated his cost of production to be $5 per peach to get a peach grown off of a tree. That would be over $100 per peach in today's time. It was pretty well recognized that peaches didn't grow in the cooler temperatures of the Front Range with the harsh winds and extreme temperature shifts that the Front Range gets. Apricots are even more tenuous crop, although the trees are very cold hardy and drought tolerant as a rule. Plums grew well along the Front Range, but it was hard to get a good market for them, and that was as true today as it was back then. Pears grow well, but they take a long time to bear, an enormous amount of patience. They are a bit more prone to fire blight along the Front Range, too. As the orchard districts spread out and the main economy of orchards in Colorado moved to the western slope and the center of growing moved to Mesa and Delta counties, apples became the dominant crop in Delta County, although initially that was the most dominant crop grown in the Grand Valley as well. As growers started moving into the Grand Valley, codling moth didn't exist there yet. By 1910, 1911, they had $1 million fruit crop there, mostly with apples. By 1920, people were abandoning their orchards because codling moth had come in and become so prolific there. In Delta County, in the Western District, and in southwest Colorado, in the Southwest District down in Montezuma and La Plata counties, because of the relatively high altitude of the orchards, 6,000 to 7,000 feet above sea level, codling moth was not as endemic. There were still worms in apples, and that would continue until DDT became commercially available in the early 50s. But Montezuma County and Delta County were able to stay into the orchard business because cooler nighttime temperatures somewhat retarded the effects of codling moth. They decreased the numbers. What the growers on the Front Range had seen, though, during the 1860s and 1870s was that cherries, especially the pie cherries, the tart cherries, grew well there. And that's what they put their focus into. In the Grand Valley, it was initially apples that were growing there, but as they saw that they could grow peaches well and they could start canneries for peaches, and then with the railroad coming into the Grand Valley and eventually the highway going through the Grand Valley, they were in a perfect place combined with an absolute perfect growing location for peaches. Palisade District is one of the greatest peach growing areas on earth. Given the relative ease of picking and harvesting peaches compared to cherries, and the higher value of peaches, it made a lot of sense for growers to convert to peaches, and that's what they did over on the Front Range, or on the Palisades area. On the Front Range, however, they saw the opportunities from pie cherries. These trees, again, had the ability to grow well in these colder, harsher areas on fairly dry soils. The other great advantage that growers had with pie cherries is that pie cherries, or tart cherries as they're also known as, are mostly a canned product used in baking. So if you have a cannery nearby, preferably by a rail line, you can start to crank out massive amounts of cherries that can go into production, into canning, which can be shipped across the rest of the country. And that's exactly what happened. The Springglade Orchard here in Loveland was considered the largest cherry orchard west of the Mississippi, is what I think the truth of it was. But it was an extraordinary large cherry orchard. When they were growing the sheer numbers, thousands and thousands of cherry trees that many of these growers were growing, especially up along the northern Front Range and down in Fremont County, they needed to have different varieties that ripened at different times. And though many different types of cherries were experimented with, by the 1920s, 1930s, it had really settled onto three varieties. The early Richmond, which was followed by the English Morello, which was followed by the Montmorency. With the different harvesting times, this allowed labor, which at this time was still a lot of family labor, to come in, or neighbor labor, to come in and help with the harvest. This is still before large migrant crews were coming in. So to be able to break up a crop over a month, 6-week period of time is incredibly helpful and basic to the survival of the farm and the prosperity of the farm itself. Of course, the cherries came in such large numbers and such high quantities and of such large quality and size that they had to design specialty boxcars. As you can see, the cherry industry became a big hit with not only producers and growers, but tourism and marketing the Loveland area and the Berthoud area to people from around the country with the high quality of its fruit. Here was the canning factory in Loveland. Both Loveland and Fremont County had numerous canning factories there. B.F. Rockefeller, one of the early pioneer growers in Canyon City, had a factory. The better known one was the Roundcrest, which was owned by the Colorado prisons, which kept operating as a cannery, even though it started to lose money. After World War II, it kept operating as a loss until finally the prison system got rid of it. These canneries were so important, though, to be able to have a value-added product for these cherries. This is as true now as it was then. If there is the ability to easily process the fruit, there will be less waste with the fruit. Another thing we see and have learned from the historic records is that the growers were at their best when they worked together. According to E.P. Sandston, state horticulturist, that rarely happened because growers didn't really work well together. But there are instances, especially around Fremont County, in Delta County, and in Mesa County, of growers' associations that would work as packing houses, sorting and packing houses and processing facilities and shipping places for these cherries to go to, so that every grower didn't have to have their own setup. They could concentrate on the growing end of it instead of the marketing end. Sometimes these associations worked out well and sometimes they didn't, but the more successful ones worked better because they cooperated well and they were competently run. When peonia started being planted in orchards, it didn't take long there for people to realize that sweet cherries could grow there very well. Sweet cherries, Prunus avium, tend to be these much larger trees. These are the beautiful cherry bark you think of so much. Tart cherries tend to have more silvery bark. These ones tend to have more of the maroon bark to them. There's an old cherry tree we saw, Royal Land, which was a red one, was just a massive, massive tree with this beautiful wood on it. The tree was probably 20 feet tall and more than that wide. You see some of these old trees, that the aviums, the sweet cherries, tend to live longer than the pie cherry trees. Pie cherry trees tend to live longer than peach trees, but they don't tend to live like apples do. We do see some very old, especially Royal Lands around. The sweet cherry varieties that were grown here a lot were, Royal Land was a real common one. That was a Napoleonic cherry. It's a yellow cherry that blushes red. There's multiple different names for those type of cherries. The Black Tartarian was a local favorite. Black Tartarian got replaced by Bing, even though Bing was not as high of a quality for a fresh eating cherry. Bing was a little bit tougher skin, which made it a better shipping cherry. But Black Tartarian was a much more richly flavored and a bit more cold hardy. Royal Duke is actually a cross between a sweet cherry and a tart cherry. Prunus hybridizes easily, and this was an example of a cross between those two species. It was grown quite a bit on the Front Range and quite a bit around the rest of the state, never in big numbers, but it was well dispersed. 16 to 1 is a cherry that we've seen on records, but we can find absolutely no other information about from old catalogs, Seed Savers Exchange, different websites, historical records. We cannot find it. It's not in the cherries of New York. It seemed to be one that's lost to history. It's entirely possible that 16 to 1 has another name to it also, though, so it may be a more common cherry. Here's an old cherry tree from over in the Animas Valley up in Hermosa, north of Durango. This was one of those little valleys, small area acres-wise, pretty tight little drainage coming out of Hermosa Creek, but it creates these little shelves there above the valley floor of the Animas Valley, which means that the cold air drifts off of these shelves and down to the valley floor and on down to Durango. So it's this really favorable growing condition, and these folks realized pretty early on that they could grow cherry trees here. So there's some remarkable old cherry trees still in that area. It was a place that was well known in its time for growing some of the finer cherries around. Colorado has so many microclimates that if you are in one of those and you are a grower, take advantage of it. See what will actually grow there. There's a lot of historic information to guide you, but these trees that people say won't grow will grow if you're in the right place. Paonia was the one place that was really well associated with sweet cherries, and it is a place that has held on to its cherry festival to these days. Even though the sidewalks probably no longer sprinkle with the white snow of flower petals from the cherry flowers in the spring, it is still something that is culturally important to the town and something with great economic potential there. The trees and the history of the trees isn't about the past, it's about the future. It's about taking these parts of historic economies and putting them forward into future economies. In Loveland, their Cherry Blossom Festival that was held first in the 1930s, early 1930s, has switched over to a Cherry Pie Festival, which still holds memories of the old days of Berthoud in Loveland and in the cherry growing areas up around there. It seems like so much of that land now is being swallowed up by subdivision, but there is still a place for tart cherries up there and for pie cherries there. And with the local foods, restaurant, bakery scenes that are all up and down the Front Range, there seems to be an excellent market for the fruit still if somebody wants to get out there and start growing some of these trees and some of these varieties again. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this presentation.